Всім добрий вечір.
On behalf of the brave, on behalf of every father and every mother who waits for freedom, on behalf of our warriors, and paves the way for a new history.
Thank you. We will now go to Bionade for an update on the goings-on at USAID.
Yeah, let's talk about USAID. Let's start with a small rundown of what happened and then about the latest news. USAID has faced unprecedented disruptions in 2025 following a near total freeze on US foreign aid ordered by President Donald Trump on January 20th. The decision halted funding for numerous humanitarian programs worldwide, including in Ukraine, Africa, and Latin America. Just days later, on January 24th, Peter Morocco, head of the Office of Foreign Assistance, directed an immediate pause on new USAID contracts and ongoing projects. This move signaled a shift in US foreign policy, leaving many local and international NGOs without critical funding. The situation escalated on February 6th, when USAID underwent massive layoffs, cutting its workforce from over 10,000 employees to just 300. These cuts forced the organization to halt or scale down key programs, including initiatives providing medical aid, food security, and emergency relief. Legal challenges quickly followed. On February 8, U.S. District Judge Carl J. Nichols issued a temporary restraining order to block further layoffs. However, this did not restore operations, as must USAID activities remain frozen. Then, on February 13th, Judge Amir Ali ruled that the Trump administration must temporarily restore funding for the key programs, arguing that suspending congressional-approved aid violated federal law. Despite these rulings, aid funding remained blocked. On February 28, several foreign aid organizations petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court, urging the government to release nearly $2 billion owed for completed humanitarian work. Finally, on March 6th, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in favor of upholding Judge Ali's decision, ordering the Trump administration to resume the payments. While this ruling may allow some USAID operations to restart, many programs remain in limbo. The full extent of USAID's future role in global humanitarian aid is still uncertain as the situation continues to develop. Recent reports have highlighted a dispute between Elon Musk, head of the DOGE department, and the Secretary of State Marco Rubio concerning the future of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. The conflict centers on Musk's aggressive push to dismantle USAID, which he has labeled as a criminal organization and beyond repair, advocating for its shutdown as part of broader government efficiency measures. In early 2025, Musk's team attempted to access classified USAID information without proper clearances, leading to an internal turmoil. Subsequently, USAID's website and social media accounts were taken offline, staff were dismissed, and overseas operations were halted. In response, Secretary Rubio declared himself acting administrator of USAID, asserting the agency's independence and challenging Musk's actions. The tension escalated during a White House meeting where Musk criticized Rubio for insufficient staff reductions at USAID. Rubio reported by highlighting that 1,500 State Department officials had accepted buyouts under President Trump's initiatives. President Trump intervened to de-escalate the situation, emphasizing the need for collaboration among his team. These developments have raised concerns about the impact on global humanitarian aid efforts traditionally supported by USAID, as well as debates over the legality and implications of such abrupt administrative changes. Yeah, that is basically the situation right now. We will see how this continues. If there will be more lawsuits, the people need to be rehired. Wouldn't be the first time we see this from Mr. Musk, that he kicks people out and then has to rehire them. So we will see how this continues, but that is what we know for now about USAID.
Thank you, Bionade. So we'll now move to Brendan, who, of course, does research on Kherson. He checks all the press updates there and follows a lot of stuff that goes on there. And he just wanted to. He hasn't updated us in a while about what's going on in Kherson, so we wanted to have him stop by, let us know. So, Brendan, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, Tochnyi. It's good to be back. It's been a long time, I think maybe since November since I've been on stream. I've been a busy bober, mostly working with Andrew's map. We've had like some record level days in terms of number of markers and notifications, reaching almost like 500 news stories a day in some cases, but usually somewhere around like 300. So it's been busy. So that's why I haven't had so much time to share my stuff on Tochnyi, and I've been working on tracking Kherson in my spare time. So I want to kind of give people an update because I haven't written anything on Tochnyi about this, and it's been almost 5 months now. But since November, I kind of want to give an update on the situation since then. What we've seen in the last 2 months is we had before civilians being targeted specifically by FPV and Mavic drones. You can throw in another kind of drone with that as well now, outside of Kherson in the suburbs and smaller villages along the Dnipro. We're also having Molnia fixed wing drones being flown into houses along and positions along the Dnipro. What we have in Kherson here is pretty horrific. I didn't think these numbers would get to where they are right now, but just since June, we've had almost 2,000 civilian casualties between drones and shelling. Right now, it stands at 1,955 as of the 7th of March. And if I'm correct, I think we had another dozen civilian casualties yesterday, and today seems like it's pretty bad too from the updates that I've gotten on Telegram. So it's not showing any signs of slowing down. It kind of did for a little while in January, it took a break more or less, hit kind of a lull, but we're starting to see things ramp back up. And we'll get into some data that'll show what's going on, where it's going on, and what's being done about it, because I also want to talk about some updates on the war on transportation, but also about anti-drone warfare. And then a big question that is actually in the headlines today. It was in an article from the Telegraph by Roland Oliphant about storming the Dnipro. There's talk, and there's been talk for a while, of the Russians trying an amphibious operation across the Dnipro River to try and gain a foothold or a bridgehead on the other side of the Dnipro before any sort of cessation of hostilities, potentially. And I've been looking at that and tracking that since about December 20th, when talk of like 300 boats were emerging. So we can dive into storming the Dnipro, how they might do it, how they've been doing so far, and whether or not that's actually something that's feasible. So getting into the civilian casualties, I want to talk about that first, because I think that's the most important thing here before we do any military analysis, is just understand the lives that are affected here. In January, there were 231 Ukrainian non-combatant casualties alone, and in February, 205. So we had 28 civilians killed in January, another 18 killed in February. So early January was really bad. The first week of January, there were almost 70 civilian casualties in 1 week, mostly due to drones. As you can see, drones killed 20 people and wounded 132 in that month alone. Whereas miscellaneous shelling, so we're talking about bombing, we're talking about missile strikes, we're talking about mortars, indirect tank fire, artillery shelling of all kinds. We still had 8 people killed and 71 wounded, but it pales in comparison to the amount of people killed and wounded by drones. And it wasn't the case when I was looking at Kherson before, that drones were doing most of the killing. And what I've done in my most recent graph is I've tried to split the shelling and drone casualties out from each other. So you can see the red line is the drone casualties sort of increasing as we get towards sort of more recent months, whereas shelling and drones were competing as sort of the main method of terror and the main method of genocide in this case throughout October and early November. But it was around December and January that we really started to see things shift completely to drones. There was a marked lull in shelling throughout the sort of early winter months. And as we moved into sort of the later winter months, more recently in February, we've seen drones really kind of come back to life here. Taking a look at drone casualties in total, we have now 1,126 civilian and non-combatant casualties. So when I'm saying non-combatant, I want listeners to understand that's including patrol police officers involved in civilian evacuation operations. And it's also involving anybody who is a victim of remote mining that has been placed by drones. So most of the remote mining, little anti-personnel mines, the pedal mines being placed around Kherson, those are a relatively common method of Russian terror in this case. Specifically, the roads in and out of Kherson are frequently mined, and the villages surrounding Kherson, their main highways, are frequently mined. So a lot of the times you have people that are driving their car and they run over an anti-personnel mine or an anti-vehicle mine, and they're wounded in the process. So that's all included within drone casualties as well. So 1,126. Currently, 90 people have due to drones just since June. So it's pretty horrific. I didn't think I would see these kinds of numbers when I started tracking back in June. So moving on to the next sort of aspect of this. One of the main tactics that the Russians use is, I call it the war on transportation, but it stems from the rhetoric they use, where highlighting attacks on buses as being sort of, they claim, dual purpose, meaning that they claim Ukrainians are using the buses within Kherson mostly for military purposes, and then using them also as civilian transports, trying to say that justifies the attack somehow. That's not necessarily true, though. One other thing they'll also say is they'll say that bombs are planted on the buses by Ukrainians to make it look like there was a war crime, which is ridiculous. As journalists like Zarina Zabriskie have gone on the ground on the scene and picked up the remnants of drones from such attacks. So we have physical evidence that disproves the sort of the propagandist line that's coming out of the Russian forces here. So I'm not going to read through all of this here, but I wanted to present sort of the volume of what we have. This is all from Andrew's map. Geolocated strikes and non-geolocated strikes, and it's not comprehensive. There definitely are more. I would need to do probably a third search through the database to really say that I have everything, but we have 21 of them just through early January, and we've had at least a half dozen more since early January. We're nearing 30 mass casualty events here. And that's the goal, right? With the war on transportation, it's designed specifically to create mass casualty events among the civilian population. We see this war on transportation, at least early on, starting to take shape as artillery shelling of bus yards. And we saw that in like June and July of 2024. But it began to ramp up in August with the human safari as civilians were being hunted on foot or on their bicycles or on their mopeds. We also saw the buses emerging in about late August, early September, as being sort of a prime target. And it kind of comes and goes in waves, right? The Russians aren't always able to catch such targets. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. And just because we don't have video evidence of it doesn't mean that there aren't more examples of it. Not everything gets published, obviously. We can say safely that there's about 30 of such events, which usually cause some pretty horrific injuries because it creates sort of a captive environment where the victims have no way to escape or no way to shield themselves. And they're completely surprised by the attack, usually. Just this week, we had one such attack. The war on transportation struck again this week on March 2nd. There were 2 people killed and 10 wounded. A 53-year-old woman died on scene. A 61-year-old woman died in the ICU from her injuries, as well as 6 men who were also wounded, ranging from 19 to 72 years old, and 4 women ranging from 58 to 73 years old. We see, again, it's mainly elderly people who are falling victim to such attacks, right? The attacks have always skewed towards the elderly, and that was something we saw early on, and that's actually what caught my attention towards the human safari at first. I was seeing reports of 87, 88-year-old women being hit by drones, and that was unfathomable to me, and that's what got me investigating it, was the volume of old women being hunted by Russians. So that's exactly what's continuing to happen. The war on transportation in this case, it was not as successful as past strikes. Even though 2 people died, the bus driver heroically drove the bus straight to the hospital whilst under drone fire and shelling, and got the other victims medical care before they passed away, as many of the victims were in a pretty severe state from the reports on the ground. So this could have been a lot worse than it already was, and it's already a horrific event. Moving on, this is a question that has been sort of lingering for the last 8 to 9 months that we've been paying attention to the human safari, the war on transportation, and the Kherson direction in general. And it also is an applicable question towards drone warfare generally. We need to be talking about what's being done to stop the human safari and what's being done to stop this sort of explosion of drone warfare. So moving into anti-drone warfare, we started to see in late January statistics published by Kherson Governor Alexander Prokudin, and he's been doing another set of data will come out tomorrow morning, every Monday morning. If you want to check that out yourself, I suggest you go to his Telegram channel or his Facebook, where he uploads the data. I've actually gathered all this data together, so if people want to look at the data in charts and graphs, I have it all publicly available as a resource in my Kherson Weekly articles. My most recent one features this. And so this past week, we saw almost 2,000 attacks. It's actually down about 40 attacks from the week prior. We had 1,991 attacks last week. Not all of them, though, are occurring within Kherson and Antonivka itself. So I've outlined with OpenStreetMap there the Khersonska urban hromada, which is the urban community surrounding Kherson city. It includes Antonivka. It stretches up towards Nadnipransk as well, and Chornobayevka is kind of left out. So it's the administrative district. Prokudin has used that as sort of a method or a parameter of organizing the data. And it's interesting because most of our casualty reports are coming from inside the urban hromada, but actually most of the drone attacks are happening outside of it, which I thought that was interesting because with the reports that I get working with Andrew's database, I don't necessarily get the full volume of reports. I just get the reports that result in something, like damage to power grids or civilian casualty or a destroyed car or a building or whatever it might be. The other drone attacks or the attempted drone attacks that don't necessarily fall through, we don't necessarily see a lot of those on video. We don't get reports about them. So that's why this is really useful data, in my opinion, is because it's giving us a window into that aspect of the human safari and of drone warfare generally. That isn't necessarily tracked super well. So just since the 20th of January, we've had 10,562 drone attacks in all of Kherson Rayon, not even all of Kherson Oblast. We're just talking about Kherson Rayon. So those 10,000 attacks, those are including FPVs, those are including Mavic skid drops, right? And we're getting about an average of 1,750 per week, but that is climbing. And we'll take a look at that in a second here. But just to get your bearings, more or less, we're getting more drone attacks in the periphery, less drone attacks inside. And inside the city, they're much less successful. Typically, we're getting like 80 to 75 or 75 to 80% of drones are being intercepted, according to Alexander Prokudin. So it's relatively high. But if we take a look at the next set of data, we're going to start to see some more interesting developments here. So what we have here are the weekly totals. So the blue line, that is the total of the entirety of Kherson Rayon. So we're nearing about 2,000 here in recent weeks. Compared to late January, we were more around like the 1,300, 1,400 range. So we are seeing sort of a gradual, I think, increase in number of drone attacks overall. One really interesting aspect of this, the orange and red lines down at the bottom of the graph, those are the drone attacks in Kherson urban Hromada, and the destroyed drones inside Kherson urban Hromada. And what we're seeing is like somewhere around like 85 to 90% of all drones that attack Kherson city itself are being destroyed or intercepted. But we're still having this massive amount of civilian casualties still, right? Which I think implies that it could be much, much worse if we didn't have this new, there haven't been many reports about it, but it just emerged this week actually through Zarina Zabrisky's reporting, a new centralized EW center that monitors constantly the environment around Kherson. And Alexander Prokudin has described it as sort of, in Zarina's interview with him, as a wall, or you could even think of it as like an extension of the river, like it's a moat, but it's an electronic warfare moat that helps protect the city. And they're constantly monitoring the environment to pick up what piece of the spectrum is being used by the drones that are interdicting the EW wall. And then they'll adjust their electronic warfare equipment to jam at that frequency. They have the ability, from what I gather, to sort of target certain areas, switch certain areas on and off, so you're not constantly jamming. I think you're only jamming when you sense something, but I could be wrong about that. I may have misinterpreted that from the interview. But he's described it as Star Wars, and it's a new world-class EW system in his description. And it seems fairly effective based on his statistics, if we're to take his statistics at face value. More concerning, though, is the interception rates outside of Kherson city. So when we're looking at places like Sadova, Mykilska, heading up towards Lvova and Olhivka and Mykolaievka, moving up the river towards Beryaslavsky Rayon, we're getting much more casualty reports now, but that's outside the purview of my data study. So I'm going to start retroactively counting the casualties in Beryaslavsky Rayon to get the northern half of Kherson Oblast to kind of fill in the picture here, because I think the concentration of EW assets within Kherson city itself is proving very effective, but the inability to concentrate EW within the periphery of Kherson Rayon and in Beryaslavsky Rayon by extension is proving to be problematic. So we had an interception rate around like 60% outside of Kherson itself, whilst we had a interception rate more around 70% other weeks. So there are some weeks where volume, I think, is an issue. So these last few weeks, last 3 weeks, we've seen outside of Kherson Rayon, they haven't, outside of Kherson urban Hromada, my bad. I'm sorry for mixing up the administrative districts there. We see that they're having trouble dealing with volume of strikes. The interception percentage is driven down, and I think there's like a threshold of about 1,500 strikes on average outside of Khersonska Hromada that the EW and mobile fire groups are able to keep up with the amount of drones. I think that seems to be a threshold, but we'll see what the future data says about that. And Ukrainian capabilities to deal with that volume. And this is the averages. I did some claimed effectiveness. So this is the rounded number that's given by Alexander Prokudin at the beginning of every week. I run the numbers myself and figure out the averages and what the actual effectiveness is. We can see there are some problem areas to the far right of the chart, 58.79% interception rate outside of Khersonska Hromada 2 weeks ago. So that was relatively a problematic week, where we also have some bright points, which are more along the line of like the average 4 or 5 weeks ago when we had 79%. And the first week of data being released when they were also at 79%. So it really fluctuates outside. And those 2 weeks that had 79% interception were also the 2 weeks with the lowest volume of drone attacks. So I really think volume is the problem here. Which is, I think, a logical conclusion. And let's talk about storming the Dnipro. Starting around December 20th, reports of 300 boats started to emerge. I think there was articles in pretty much every major publication that would that was able to get an interview with Prokudin. And I know Forbes specifically ran the article. This claim of 300 boats being used to storm the Dnipro emerged, and I was immediately skeptical of whether or not that could actually happen. Could the Russians actually cross the Dnipro in a meaningful way and potentially threaten Kherson city? And it needed some investigating. So what I've been doing for the last couple months is I've been tracking the Southern Joint Task Force command based out of Odessa. And I take their daily or every other day, more or less, reported losses, and I track them by platform. And then also I take their data that is to do with reported assaults. So in 3 directions, they have the purview of command. So they're in charge of defending in the Huliaipola direction, the Orikhiv direction. Both of those are in Zaporizhia Oblast, so not really important to what I'm looking at. And then they take care of they call it the Pridniprovsky direction. So the cross Dnipro direction. So that's where I've been focusing my data study, is really on the cross Dnipro direction. But we do see how Orikhiv and Huliaipola also do pull assets away and pull capabilities away from Russian forces along the Dnipro. So we see reduced offensive intensities in the Dnipro direction when we have increased offensive intensities in Orikhiv and Huliaipola. And you can make that interchangeable with all 3 of those directions. So it really seems the Russian command in that section is not able to carry out offensive efforts in all 3 directions at the same time. And on average, we've been getting about like 1 boat assault, 2 boat assaults a day across the Dnipro, and they are highly unsuccessful. Most of them, from my understanding, are failed assaults. If they are able to get infantry out to the islands in the delta of the Dnipro River, which we'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes, then they're picked off one by one by Ukrainian drones. Specifically in November, we saw FPV and large hexacopter, quadcopter drones, so Heavy Shot, Vampire, Kazan, and can't remember the other one off the top of my head, but large hexacopter and quadcopter bomber drones that are being used at night are very effective in sort of destroying Russian offensive capabilities across the Dnipro, preventing successful landings on the islands. And when there are successful landings on the islands, they are pretty much immediately destroyed, as the island regions don't really offer a lot of cover. It's mostly reeds and brush, and you're easily spotted by thermal Ukrainian Mavics. We see basically every time there's an assault, there's basically 1 boat destroyed. So it lines up in terms of the data. It's more or less being used as a method of punishment. Soldiers in the 70th Motor Rifle Division, soldiers in what I think is the 61st Naval Infantry Brigade, and the 80th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade are being forced into these assaults against their will, or forced by their commanders to the meat assault. So other things that have happened as well to disrupt Russian offensive potential are deep strikes, not by missiles necessarily or rockets of any kind, but actually by night bomber drones in some cases, or by reconnaissance assets that are calling in, like a HIMARS strike or something along those lines. So we saw a strike on Zalizny Port in southern Kherson, occupied Kherson Oblast on March 4th, with artillery reconnaissance being performed by the 14th Unmanned Systems Regiment. And we also saw a 14th Army Corps command post, which is that's the parent Army Corps of the 80th Separate Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade of the Russian Northern Fleet. They were hit by a night drone attack by Huller. So GUR got them good, which was great to see. And just to get kind of an idea of the scale of destruction of Russian forces here, we've had 4,235 reported Russian losses in personnel between December 20th and 7th or 1st of March. Sorry, this data only goes up to 1st of March. That is some caveats there, right? That's 3 directions, but basically you have, every time you have a boat assault, you have 3 to 5 guys, sometimes more, on each boat, and you can kind of do the math from there to kind of see how that might factor into the 4,000 casualties that we have here. Some other really important assets that have been destroyed, I would like to highlight 160 some odd Starlinks have really disrupted Russian offensive capabilities, about 500 artillery systems, and around 1,300 armored, unarmored IMVs, APCs. The Southern Joint Task Force throws them all into one category. 1,300 armored vehicles. Really insane amount of assets. And then something we saw more recently, after we saw a spike in assaults across the Dnipro between the 30th of January and the 3rd of February, we saw this massive drone bombing campaign on Russian blindages. So fortifications, command posts, observation posts being reported to be wiped out in record numbers in the last 6 weeks. That has since changed now that the Russians are really focused, I think, on the Orikhiv direction. So they're really trying to kind of undo the small amount of gains that were accrued by Ukrainian forces in the 2023 counteroffensive near Robotna and Novodanilivka, Novoandrivka, Kamyanska, that area. So that leads me to discuss the geography, and then I am all done. You guys don't have to hear me anymore. Next slide, last slide, please. Thank you. So where are the Russians going to do it, if they're going to do it? Because we do get the sense that they're still going to try this, even though it does seem rather suicidal. 3 locations, Antonivka, Sadova, and Kizomis. I've labeled those locations 2, 3, and 4 here, respectively. The picture labeled number 1, that's sort of a bird's eye view of the topography of the Delta, Dnipro Delta Kherson region. And I think it's really important to understand why storming the Dnipro is so hard for the Russians. It is elevation. The change in elevation between the Russian occupied bank and the Ukrainian occupied bank is significant. Sometimes we're talking like 50 to 100 meters in sea level. So difference, that is. So that creates some pretty precarious situations for an offensive force. So they've selected some locations where actually low-lying terrain may give them the ability to get a foothold. And I liken it to attacks that we've seen with the Russians where it's the small meat waves, like not like massive I don't know how to describe it, massive waves of infantry, right, being thrown at the front line. It's not like that at all. Rather, it's this piecemeal 1 or 2 boats a day on these very specific locations to try and gain a foothold. Once a foothold is grabbed, then you can exploit by pumping in manpower as much as you need to, right? Can the Russians do that? I don't know. Their boats are pretty much half gone at this point of the 300 that they supposedly had. They have some PTS-2s that we've seen, which are old Soviet amphibious transporters. The problem with those is they're open top. They can carry supposedly 75 infantry, but I would like to see that happen. And they only go 12 kilometers per hour in the water, so that's drone bait, if you ask me. That would be an absolute slaughter. So taking a look at Antonivka, why would you storm there? Well, in image 2, you can see the green terrain, right, is Antonivka. The bank there, it does offer around the bridge a sort of spot for covered landings. And we've actually seen fiber optic drones using the bridge as cover to get into the city and then start to wreak havoc around Antonivka. So you could do the same thing theoretically with boats, and they have been. Not successfully, but they have been doing it. Then looking at Sadova, which is just to the east of Antonivka. Sadova is on a pretty strategic location that was also exploited by the Red Army in 1943 and 44 when they were trying to storm the Dnipro as well. And I based a lot of my analysis off of Russian Red Army plans from 43 and 44 in the past to understand where they're going with this. And I think it tracks for the most part. And Alexander Prokudin, in an interview with the Telegraph today, basically confirmed this as well. Kizomis, I think, is the place where they're going to concentrate their main effort, their largest amount of forces, simply because between Tomanabolka and Belozerka, there's sort of this like 10-kilometer wide, flat, low-lying plain that can be flooded with infantry. And the defenses, if overcome, you're not really going to have much elevation until you get past Belozerka, until you get past Rozliv into an area where you could potentially start to interdict supply lines into Kherson as well. So if the Russians were able to concentrate their efforts on Kizomis, which they have been trying near Nestriha Ostrov, which is one of the islands nearby, if they can do that, then they might be able to push, and this is like best case scenario for the Russians. I actually don't think this is going to happen, but they might be able to interdict a supply route from Mykolaiv to Kherson, which I think is the goal, which that was one of the goals of the Soviet offensive in 1943 and 44, when in 1944, they stormed the Dnipro, I think it's 80 something years ago next week. So it was on around the early second week of March. Early part of March is when they did that. So I think you might see some sort of historical cosplay potentially in the next couple of weeks with an uptick of cross Dnipro assaults, because we know how the Russians like to play history, like to relive history in some capacity, especially like through that post-Soviet lens, trying to get back to that whole revanchist aspect of it. I think you could see something potentially next week. I don't think it'll be successful, and I don't think it'll be big, but I do think that the Russians are serious about trying something across the Dnipro in 2025. And that's where I'll leave it.
First of all, thank you, Brendan, for the excellent work, and that you actually came back to Tochnyi to do this update for us. I think a lot of people gladly appreciated it. I definitely did. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and Slava Ukraini.
And I am Slava.
On behalf of the brave.